Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He saw the new commander named Rip, who also happens to look pretty physically fit, so then he got a rest in peace that is torn a little bit so that he could play a ripped Rip in a ripped Rip deck. It's Dana Roach.
That was good. I like that one.
Thanks.
I had big plans in 2020 to do a marathon, and I wound up not getting around to it, and then I didn't do one in 2021 and 2022 and in 2023, and like at this point it's just become a running joke.
How I should have seen that one coming, actually. That one I should have been able to play the spell, saw it coming, and counter that spell.
Sure,
actually.
right, yeah.
How did I not? Okay, I've been around you guys long enough that these shouldn't get me the way that they still do.
We haven't done dad jokes in a few weeks, so like you're probably getting a little bit rusty.
Yeah, honestly, every time that I think I'm getting a little bit better at it, and then, oh no, they're a dangerous surprise every time. I guess that's it. Maybe you're keeping me on my toes. All right. Dana, it's the two of us on this week's episode. What are we talking about this week?
We're talking about Salt Scores 2024 edition.
Yes, it's an annual tradition here on EDHREC to poll the community about their least favorite cards to see in the Commander format, the stuff that they don't really like to play against. And so we've completed a new round of Salt polling, and we've got new results to go over. I'm really excited to dive deep into the numbers for this episode. But of course, before we can get too far into it, we've got some shout outs that we got to do first.
We are very excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. Simply put, we use their products from their sleeves to their boxes to their bags, and that makes for an easy partnership for us. With MagicCon Las Vegas coming up at the end of October, you will find Matt and Joey and I all there playing games with our decks stylishly protected by Ultimate Guard products. And Ultimate Guard usually has a meet and greet kind of session at their booth where you can come find people to play games, and we will be there. So if you want to come find us, we will try to get a quick game in, and I bet you can walk away with a little bit of Ultimate Guard swag.
Heck yeah. Also, if you want to support the show, there are myriad ways to do that, whether you want to support us on patreon.com/EDHRECast, or if you just want to leave a review, leave a like and a subscribe, all that jazz. If you do sign up on Patreon, we've got a bunch of fantastic perks over there, access to our Discord, where folks are assembling games, hanging out, talking to us about decks that they're brewing, or any upcoming decks that we might be brewing. It's a really fun time over there. We even have access to the Challenge the Stats spreadsheet of all of our historic Challenge the Stats picks, and one of our favorite tiers, the Patreon shout out. Dana, who are we shouting out for this week's episode?
This week we're shouting out Farron Flintham, which is very much a James Bond character name. That's James's contact in like the Irish Special Forces or something, who he has to talk to for 20 minutes in the middle of a movie and get information on whatever bad guy he's tracking down. So Farron Flintham, that's a great name, and thank you for supporting the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Farron Flintham, for your fantastic... I'm out of alliterations. I can feel Matt's disappointment. I'm sorry, Farron, that I've let you down, but we appreciate the support so much. Thank you so much for supporting the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It really means a lot from you and from all our supporters.
Excellent. All right, Dana, now we're moving into our main topic here. We're talking about the new Salt Scores 2024 edition. We want to go over some of the most infamous cards in the format, any new risers, the new top 10 saltiest cards in the format, any cards that have moved around, dropped down, any cards that are spiking up. There's a bunch of data to get into, so gear up, everybody. We've just completed these new rounds of Salt Scores, the polling that we do on EDHREC. You can go to edhrec.com/salt to see all of these new results. Although, maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves. For folks who aren't as familiar, Dana, maybe we should actually start with, what actually does a Salt Score mean, though?
Sure. So annually, we do community voting on EDHREC for some of Commander's most salt-inducing cards, and we have past videos over the years covering each year's poll results, and there was even a deck building competition where people tried to brew up the saltiest commander possible in the most creative ways.
Oh yeah.
So as for the actual Salt Scores, players vote on a scale of 0 to 4, where 0 means it's a perfectly pleasant card, and 4 means you really do not like playing against it in EDH. And high scores can kind of help signify cards that prompt a social response. So it's the kind of thing that can help you clue in on what's the best environment to play those cards in.
Yeah, it's not about promoting saltiness. It's about being aware of which cards that maybe prompt that response, as you said, Dana. And it's like, oh, I should be, maybe a little choosier about where it is that I want to play these. Maybe I'll reserve these for the more cutthroat games that I encounter out there. We got about 1 million votes in the polling for this year, which admittedly is actually less than we've had in some previous years. It is possible that if we see any big swings in the data, it's possible that is related to a slightly smaller sample size. So as with all things, make sure that you take all of the data that we're going to share with a grain of salt in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And help myself. One anecdote I want to throw out there about this whole thing is how subjective this all is, and how it changes even in like your own brain. Like, had we had this voting, say 10 years ago, the card that annoyed me the most in the entire game was probably Insurrection. And I didn't think it wasn't fair. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. But I had a friend who played it in all of his decks because he only played red. And he would routinely just win games with like no board state because he would top deck it on turn 9 when everyone else had built up, had been playing Magic for 8 turns. And he would just like, oh, I guess I win with Insurrection. It's not a problem card. It just drove me nuts. And I would have absolutely given that a salty 4. So, just because a card is salty for a person, there's a whole lot of swing in like what makes a card something that drives you crazy.
Completely. If this was the polling was entirely up to me, we all know that Rest in Peace and Bajuka Bog and all of the Graveyard Exile effects would have scores of 4.0. They don't, because other people are around who have more measured takes than I do, which makes a lot of sense. We appreciate you all. But yeah, the subjectivity is a really great point to bring up, Dana. But it is interesting to see where a lot of those subjectivities converge here. We've got a lot of responses. So to set the stage, let's briefly go through last year's top 10 saltiest cards. Again, if you go to edhrec.com/salt, you'll see the results and you can see them throughout the previous years. The last year's top 10, we had some very infamous salty cards like Winter Orb and Stasis and Static Orb and things like that, all up in the top 10, preventing you from untapping anything and playing the game of Magic, which is probably what you were here to do in the first place.
Yeah, the top 10 last year is dominated by either cards that prevent you from playing, like you mentioned, the Winter Orb and Stasis of the World, or cards that just either win the game or provide you with a crazy amount of advantage. The Thassa's Oracles, the Expropriates, the Dockside Extortionists of the world.
Mm-hmm. And frankly, that continues to be the case from year to year to the year. We don't usually see really big shifts in the data. Although we might have a surprise to share for this year. Dana, what do things look like with the new top 10 here in 2024? Any particular standouts from the top 10 by chance?
So we're number 1 and number 2 have remained the same. Stasis and Winter Orb still salting up every dish in the kitchen they encounter. But number 3, a card brand new this year, Nadu Winged Wisdom, a creature, a commander, from out of nowhere all the way up to bronze medal winning salty card.
Yeah, got a salt score of 3.04. So again, on a scale of 0 to 4, 3.04. Y'all, you know what? We're not surprised though. Like Nadu's busto. For a quick brief reminder, 3 mana, 3/4 bird wizard with flying. Creatures you control have, quote, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn, end quote. Source of a lot of consternation in Modern was a card that they said they were deliberately trying to make something appealing for Commander, and then it ruined a whole Modern format. I have to assume that some of the saltiness isn't just about the gameplay of this card, although that is salt-inducing, but also about what led us to this card as well.
Yeah, there's extra baggage this card is bringing with it, I think, beyond just what it's doing at your local Commander table. I think a lot of the salt from this is also salt from what it did in other formats and how frustrating it was to see it there.
Nadu's weird, yeah. And frankly, it's the kind of thing that I don't think I want to be in a game against either. So
yes, absolutely. And similarly, in number 9, we have a new entrant as well, the One Ring, showing up in the number 9 slot, card that hasn't shown up before. Or excuse me, it showed up last year, but it moved way up from just breaking the top 30 to into the top 10, first time in the top 10.
Yeah, this one was wild. It went from a score of 2.21 up to now a score of 2.69. The One Ring is that 4 mana legendary artifact. It's got Indestructible, which might be a source of some of the consternation. It's hard to get rid of. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from anything until your next turn. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on it, but you can tap it to place burden counters on it and then draw more cards. So it's kind of an ancient craving mixed with a Teferi's protection for the first turn and a half that you play it. It's like, cool, cards, and I'm safe until next round. Very, very good. It's $118. Good Lord. Very expensive card as well.
And again, as with Nadu, this is a card who brings some baggage from what it has done in other formats, where it's, I think, as of right now, the most played card in Modern, and has definitely shown up in other Eternal formats as well. And as a colorless card, it can literally go in every single EDH deck.
Yeah, it is showing up in 7% of decks that can play it, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but again, this is a colorless card, so we're comparing that against the entire population of decks.
Sure.
Like, for context on other stuff that shows up at about that same, like Sensei's Divining Top shows up in 6% of decks. Herald's Horn shows up in 6% of decks, and that's a popular card. Just to kind of paint a picture of like how popular that really is. So like, that's a lot of decks. That is a big percentage for a colorless card.
I would dare say if this had a colorless pip, or excuse me, a colored pip in the mana cost that limited what decks it could go into, I would bet it's way less salty. I think part of the reason is people are just so tired of seeing it in every deck that it could go into.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty fair. And I think what's especially notable about the rise in the data of this card, of the One Ring specifically moving into the top 10 from spot number 29, like, every year that we do these poll results, we will see some jostling within the top 10. And even that's true this year. You know, a couple of cards fell down 1 or 2 spots. A couple of cards fell out of the top 10. Like, if folks are wondering what happened to Expropriate and to Dockside Extortionist, don't worry, they're not in the top 10 anymore, but they are still in like their spot number 14 or 15 and stuff like that. Like, they're still really high. Notably, there is the card Apocalypse that moved into the top 10 as well. It had a bit of a rise, but it's, you know, another land destruction effect that just, it's kind of trading places with a lot of other usual suspects with obliteration, things like that. We tend to see a little bit of jostling of a lot of interchangeable effects within, you know, the top 30 or so. But the One Ring is very unique in what it's able to do. So its rise, I find very notable.
And, you know, if I'm trying to predict the future here, I'm going to guess we probably won't see either of those 2 cards in the top 10 next year. Nadu will probably get replaced by whatever the next annoying broken thing is that dominates other formats, because it seems like every year there's one of those. And the One Ring will probably just, in terms of both because it's so expensive, and maybe people will just get sick of it and sick of seeing it so often. Whereas, like, even if you don't ever see Winter Orb or something show up in a game, people still kind of hate those cards, despite maybe never having actually had them dropped at a table. Those are just always going to be annoying.
That's a really good point, actually, Dana, is like the recent exposure effect that kind of happens with a lot of cards. We've seen plenty of cards that started off big and brash, but then did move down over time. Like when Xanathar Guild Kingpin came out, that one started off with a score of, it was either 1.8 or 1.6 or so. When we did the Salt scores, we happened to catch around the time that card came out, and it being able to steal stuff from your opponents, people had a big immediate thought of like, oh no, I don't like that. But as we've actually gotten exposure to it and we've seen what that deck really entails, it's, you know, people have cooled off it. It's become a lot more mellow in its Salt score. Whereas like Nadu is like currently the talk of the town. So like, of course, it's going to be on people's minds when it comes to this. And therefore you have a pretty immediate reaction. And we don't have as immediate a reaction for a lot of cards that we've either known for a long time or that we just don't happen to see all that much.
Like, Stasis will always generate that visceral reaction, and there's never going to be a Stasis 2.0 printed that
I hope not
replaces it or bumps it down the list, right? Whereas there will be something that probably kind of replaces Nadu as the flavor of the week that's super powerful and that shows up everywhere and people are sick of seeing.
Yeah. Well, and on the subject of new cards, we actually also filtered a bunch of this data just to look at the saltiest new cards that didn't exist for the polls last year. And there are some really interesting ones here to go over too. We've got the top 10 saltiest new cards. Obviously, we already know that Nadu is at the top of the list, a salt score of 3.0. Overall rank is 3 within the salt rankings. But also we've got some cards like Winter Moon showing up with a score of 2.1, or Ulamog the Defiler, Emrakul the World Anew with scores of 1.9 and 1.7. So a lot of cards from Modern Horizons are making quite a splash. And I think it has a bit to do with what we were just talking about with Nadu. These are pretty recent cards that are making quite an impression. And I wouldn't be surprised if they also mellow out as as time goes on.
For sure. And people are just seeing them now. They're new. People build new decks with new cards. You're going to see Ulamog the Defiler. You're going to see the new Emrakul. You're just going to see those show up in decks. And eventually you will see them less and less often as people either take them apart or build new lists. And they will just become, less that impulse, knee-jerk, oh, I hate that thing. People still aren't going to like them. Like, folks never like mechanics that force you to sacrifice a large part of your board state like you get on various Eldrazi, and they don't like things, Winter Moon is always going to be a card that people are going to not want to see, but the fresh factor will make those fade a little bit, I would wager.
I would wager the same, but I do want to say we can't make that claim for I think that we'll see some numbers dip down. That doesn't necessarily mean that we think they're going to fade to like a score of only 1 or 0 or anything like that.
Right.
And in fact, number 5 on the Saltiest New Cards is Maha, Its Feathers Knight, with a score of 1.6. Maha, Its Feathers Knight, if anything, that's the kind of card that I could see it going up in future years,
right? Because
I think that this is the kind of thing that doesn't just produce a knee-jerk reaction. It actually, in the game, oh man, this is actually a little bit tough. Maha, Its Feathers Knight is a 5-mana elemental bird from Bloomburrow. It has flying and trample. It's a 6/5. It has ward, discard a card, so it's a little bit harder to hit. You got a 2-for-1 yourself in order to get rid of it, but it has this ridiculously annoying ability where creatures your opponents control have base toughness of 1. So then all you have to do is play a thing like Knight of Soul's Betrayal, and this card is immediately making it so that your opponents don't get to have a single creature in play. That's the kind of effect that I could actually see getting a little bit more. It could fester a little bit more in the Salt scores as the years go on. So some of those things might mellow out over time by a couple of 0.5 or something like that, but some of them could also age like wine.
Yeah, I mean, Turgid is still in the top 10.
There you go, yeah.
Its Feathers Knight could very easily have a similar trajectory where it slides upward. And, Roaming Throne, I would wager part of the reason people don't like that is the ubiquity, similar to the One Ring. But Roaming Throne isn't a $120 card. It's not cheap, but it's much easier to find a Roaming Throne to put into your deck without breaking your budget than it is the One Ring. That's going to be, and once it eats a reprint, that price will drop even further. That's going to be a thing that's going to be frustrating people just because it fits in so many lists, and they're going to get sick of seeing it. I would wager that one sticks around as well.
Yeah, it got spot number 6 here. It has an early score of 1.59. I don't know. I could see this one going either way. Roaming Throne, I don't think it needed ward. I'm like, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
But also, speaking of things that it didn't need ward, Voya Jaws of the Conclave shows up at number 7 on the Saltiest New Cards. It's got a score of 1.46. Honestly, after all the hubbub of talk about Voya this year, surprised it's this low. I thought it might be a little bit higher. I thought it might be up closer to Nadu.
I would bet if Nadu hadn't been printed, Voya Jaws of the Conclave would be the card taking that slot as a thing people are sick of seeing and sick of dealing with. Yeah. It's just Nadu is just that much worse and has impacted other formats. So it's got a much larger bullseye on its back. But yeah, I think Nadu stole a lot of Volge's Salt Thunder.
I think also there's an exposure thing happening. I think Voya is a really good example of that, of just we saw Voya, there was a reaction to it initially, and it's kind of started to mellow. I think we're seeing Voya in the mellow process. The thing about Voya as well, compared to other cards that just go into the 99, when Nadu's at the head of someone's deck, when Voya is at the head of someone's deck, it's a lot easier for you to say, I'm not sure if I'm game for that game.
Right.
Whereas cards that actually emerge from within the 99 is a bit of a surprise. Those ones can sometimes prompt an even bigger salty reaction or a reaction that you're just oh, I'm not necessarily sure that I was on board for that, because they're harder to discover before the game begins. Where it's Dana, if you pull out a Turgid deck, it's easy for Matt to be no, So right. Commanders have in my opinion, a different relationship to Salt than cards in the 99 in terms of what could go up and what could go down.
Yeah, there's definitely a factor where again, to go back to Stasis, even if you never see Stasis or don't have a personal story or issue where it's, ruined a game of yours, you still know it's a salty card objectively. And if you're voting on, is this card a problem? Am I going to give it a 4? Something like Stasis is just a card that in your brain, despite having maybe no personal reaction, you understand why that's a salty card. Whereas some of this stuff is much more personal. Nadu feels like it's a much more personal card. A lot of these Eldrazi feel like it's much more, I had a terrible experience playing against it, therefore I am giving it a 4 or a 3 or something. It's not objective isn't the right word, but it's not a evaluation necessarily based on just looking at the card and rating it. It then becomes an experience that you had to live in, and that's why you're giving it this vote.
Really good point. And so rounding out the top 10 saltiest new cards that didn't exist during the pollings last year, we also have some stuff like Ulalek, Fused Atrocity. You mentioned Eldrazi. I wonder if this is showing up. A lot of Eldrazi with Annihilator, perhaps, are getting copied with that Ulalek ability. It's only got a score of 1.31, though. Igra, Eater of All, also doing a little bit of that Maha stuff, making your opponent's stuff easier to kill. That's got a score of 1.14. But I'm kind of curious, Dana, what you think of the non-commander card that's on this top 10 new salty cards list, and that's Flare of Denial with a score of 1.28, another version of a free type of counterspell. What are you thinking about this one?
I was actually really surprised to see this one in the top list. My guess is Flare of Denial is taking a lot of heat from Fierce Guardianship. Just the idea of a free counterspell maybe makes people have that reaction to it. Flare of Denial actually, particularly in Commander, feels relatively fair.
Interesting.
I mean, it's useful to have a free counterspell, but like you have to have a non-token blue permanent in play that you're willing to sacrifice to counter that spell. And while that's very, very useful, it's not nearly as ubiquitously useful as something like Fierce Guardianship.
Interesting. So Fierce Guardianship had a salt score of 2.22 last year. It's about spot like 25 or so. For me, this kind of feels like we definitely have that precedent set. I would agree that I'm more worried about a Fierce Guardianship than I am a Flare of Denial, but I think just the fact that any new free counterspell, it's kind of like, Wizards, can we not? Free counterspells could happen at any moment. How am I supposed to change my game plan around that? Having to live under that thrall or whatever is probably the thing that makes it more, it's kind of like, it's more about the fact that they keep making them and than it is about the individual card, perhaps. Yeah. It's more of the trend, is probably my guess.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily like having to live under the thumb of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just the notion of free counter in blue, folks just don't like that. And for good reason. We've established that's a very dangerous area for design to play in, for sure.
Indeed. Y'all, guess what? Today's episode is brought to you by Turtle Beach, the #1 brand in gaming headsets and accessories. I've been in the market for new headphones. I mean, heck, my job is editing videos and podcasts. Having good sound is imperative for me, so I'm stoked that Turtle Beach is giving our listeners the chance to get 10% off their whole order at turtlebeach.com with the promo code EDH. Their new Gen 3 Stealth 600 headset picks up so much crystal clear sound, it almost feels like cheating. We know Magic players also play tons of other great video games out there, and with these, you will hear every footstep, every reload, every enemy sneaking up on you like they're practically stomping. That's right, Turtle Beach isn't just what we call it when you cast High Tide in an Arkalos deck, they're also the brand that has headset models for PlayStation, PC, and Xbox, including cross-compatibility and Bluetooth, aka one headset for all your systems. Also, I gotta say, I love this. They have 80-hour battery life with quick charge. That's wild. Get the ultimate immersive gaming experience with Turtle Beach today. For a limited time only, head to turtlebeach.com and use code EDH for 10% off your entire order. That's 10% off your order at turtlebeach.com with promo code EDH. So, moving away now from the saltiest new cards, let's talk about some of the cards that experienced those big jumps in the data. Cards that did exist and have existed for a while, and they've been moving around. What are the cards that actually did experience a big leap upward in the data?
So number one here, Commander, Thalia and the Gitrog Monster Commander pair, salt score of 1.4, and that was a pretty big change. I mean, more than half a point change in how salty people felt like that commander was. Thrumming Stone similarly had a pretty big leap as well. Thrumming Stone gives you the ability to kind of chain multiple spells if you have a deck that happens to be playing things with the same name. So any of the you may run as many copies of this in your deck as you want to spells. And every time they release a new one, and it feels like we get a different variant on that once a year or so, Thrumming Stone shows up in that deck and maybe gets more and more annoying to play against. So I guess that one kind of makes sense for me for sure.
Yeah, Thrumming Stone saw not just one, but two cards this year that could work well with it. We got Slime Against Humanity and Templar Knight. So that card is showing up a lot more places. And again, I think it's that exposure situation of just like, oh, yeah, no, this is annoying. Actually, it just wasn't as omnipresent previously, but it is getting easier and easier to justify Thrumming Stone in these types of decks. So it had a little bit more exposure therapy going on for the year 2024. That jump by almost like over half a point is pretty big. And Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, I would actually wager that that's kind of like the thing we were talking about with Maha earlier. earlier, a commander that maybe didn't immediately register until people started playing against it. The exposure actually worked in the way of like, oh, this is kind of annoying for Thalia and the Get Rug Monster to force my stuff to be tapped all the time and it's right there in your command zone. And probably often it's at the helm of a deck that is running a number of hate bears. Usually a lot of landfall, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are a couple of other hate bears in that deck too. So there's kind of a reputation that it started to earn, most likely too.
Another one that I'm not really shocked to see up here at number 4 is Farewell. Had a pretty big leap, almost more than half of a salt point.
Oh yeah.
A card that is salty in multiple ways. It tends to kind of lock you out from playing the game a little bit by removing a whole ton of your board, depending on what the person who casts it chooses. It's very flexible, it's very ubiquitous, and I think it's one of those cards that folks are a little bit frustrated with as well, because it feels like it was a power skip. Like it was significantly stronger than the things that came before it.
Sure.
And that always feels annoying to play against when you feel like a card jumped ahead in ways it shouldn't have had to.
Farewell, for the record, when that card came out in 2022, it started off with a score of 1.1. This has been champion rising up over the years. It's now ranked number 42 with a score of 2.19. I mean, I would almost say good for you, Farewell, except no, bad for you, Farewell. And right. Dana, I gotta ask, do you even play Farewell in any of your decks? I don't play Farewell.
I don't.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it leads, don't get me wrong, I should. Every white deck I play would be better, quote unquote, in terms of like how effective it was with Farewell. It's just kind of a perfect board wipe. No matter what your board state is, you can almost always cast it in a way that affects other people more than it affects you. It's an excellent card from a power perspective. It's just not very fun and not very interesting, I don't think.
I guess, like, it is powerful, undoubtedly. And the fact that you can choose the modes for yourself, what is most beneficial to you. I think I've just moved away from a lot of symmetrical board wipes when I'm playing a deck with white in it, because there are so many other effects that feel so one-sided that I can cast it and then, like, you don't have a board anymore, but I still have some creatures that now I can attack with, has really moved into a fun aspect of white for me. It's hard for me to be particularly mad at Farewell, because a strong answer to other problem cards, I'm like, well, I'm not going to shoot the messenger, I don't want to be mad at like a powerful card that answers other very powerful cards. So I like when Farewell balances out those kinds of things, I suppose. But I also definitely understand why people feel like it's got such an effect on the game that is a little bit taxing.
I would guess also one of the problems with Farewell is it's one of those cards where oftentimes it gets cast and you're like, oh, I'm going to lose now, but I'm not going to lose for 18 minutes. Like you can see, you've just lost the board state in a way that you're not going to be able to bounce back from. Yeah. But it's going to take the other person multiple turns to get to that point where they close out the game. But it's also not so clear cut that you're like, I'm just going to scoop too. It's in that sweet spot. And I think that people find that frustrating.
Mm-hmm. I also want to take a note of some other risers that we've got on this that I think are related to some of the commanders that we've gotten. Again, kind of related to Modern Horizons stuff that we're seeing. For instance, Glacial Chasm is rising up a little bit. It got a rise of 0.49, so it went from a score of 1.2 to 1.7, showing up at number 5 on the biggest jumps that we've seen this year. And I think that owes a little bit of credit to the fact that the Necrobloom came out this year, and so a lot more people are playing this particular land that stops your opponents from being able to deal any damage to you, and the Necrobloom makes it really easy to keep that thing around and pay for that cumulative upkeep whenever the heck you want. Like, that's an easy land to manipulate in landfall decks, so more exposure to this really annoying, very controlling land. And also Styre of Stagnation is showing up. It got a boost of 0.49 as well, and that would be related to Ulalek. This is an Eldrazi that can go into the Ulalek decks, and copying those triggers is very, very good. So that one's gone up from 0.7 last year to now being at 1.27. So a lot of the recent decks that we've seen that have made a splash are budging a couple of cards up from within the 99.
Yeah, and I always like seeing Grand Arbiter Augustin the Fourth showing up on the list. That will be a salty card till the end of time. Anyone who's ever played against it immediately is like, yep, don't like that. I want no more of that. But it's also old, and it's like the grand old man of salty cards has gotten saltier this year somehow, moving up almost half a point.
Yeah. We also see the One Ring around that area as well. We mentioned that one earlier, but it's good to shout it out here. And also a couple of commanders that I know, Dana, you're a huge fan of. Well, so actually, like, Gishath has risen a little bit, but so has Miram. Yeah. And I think people are kind of catching wise. It's like, yeah, Miram's a messed up Magic card, actually. Mm-hmm. And Miram feels a little bit harder to say, in the way that, like, Nadu is, I think, a little bit easier to be like, yo, I'm not sure if I'm game for that game. Miram is a little bit harder to be like, I don't know if I'm in the mood for a Miram, because it's so appealing. And so it's like, what rank number 5? Rank number 6, 20,000 Miram decks out there. Rank number 6 is a popular thing. And all it's doing is just dragons. It's just a dragon deck. What, you're mad at a dragon deck? Like, Nadu is transparently busto. Miram is doubling your dragons, which just feels fun, and I don't want to take that away from anyone, but it is also a very, very busted card. It's harder to remove yourself from the Miram experience than the Nadu experience, so I think that's probably why Miram has seen a little bit of an uptick, if I had to guess.
Yeah, Miriam's an interesting one. A lot of the cards on here, that we've talked about are ones that keep you from playing the game or something, or maybe generate game-winning advantage like the One Ring. Miriam's a weird one. It's not that it just generates game-winning advantage, but it always feels to me like it does it too easily almost. And that's not a bad thing, I guess. A card like being really efficient and doing its job really well shouldn't be negative.
Yeah.
But it always feels that way to me for some reason.
I think also because you play a lot of decks where like you have to bend over backwards, do a couple of handstands, do a couple of backflips before you get to draw your one card, make one treasure token, and give something -1. Like you tend to play a very different style of deck. So when it took you 8 game actions to produce the same amount of value that Miram is doing, I can see why you especially are kind of like, hey,
for sure, yeah. And that's not the fault of anyone who's playing Miriam that I get frustrated with that. So I mean that's on me in my head. But it's definitely an interesting thing because I don't have that reaction to any of the other cards we've talked about.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's actually very important to take note of, and also a thing that kind of informs a lot of stuff that gets onto the banned list, right? It's not just about what restricts other players. Those are probably easier to socially be kind of like I don't enjoy playing against stacks and stuff like that.
Right.
Those are pretty obvious, whereas cards that create such a huge push forward in terms of the resources that are out there, that's a thing that is a little bit more difficult to police, and that's why things like Primeval Titan wind up on the banned list because of the resource gap that they create. And so when it comes to commanders doing that too, it's I can see how that actually does eventually creep up in terms of the salt or the social effect that sometimes those have, because they do have a little bit of that extra baggage. It's just a different type of baggage than a lot of the other obvious baggage is, I guess maybe the way that I'll phrase it. Dana, we've been talking here about the biggest jumps upward, but I think we also got to talk about some cards that have fallen down in the salt scores. Good for them, by the way.
Yeah. Umbra's Fear Manifest there with the biggest drop was just over half a point salt change. Umbra's the sugariest gained this year. I don't know how you want to phrase that, but it's gotten less offensive to people more than any other card this year by a pretty significant margin too, over Scoot Mob of all cards.
Yeah, good for you, Scoot Mob. Yeah, it's also gone down, this one by 0.42. So, Umbris went from 1.1 to 0.56. Scoot Mob has gone from 0.49 to 0.06. Yeah. They weren't necessarily huge. They weren't high up in the list to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I think Umbris exiling cards from people's library, it's the kind of thing that's just you know what, I can take this. I can board wipe at the right time, make sure that Umbris doesn't get to stick around and play and just murk the player themselves if they're using it. People have learned how to adapt to them perfectly fine.
On the other hand, at number 3, getting less salty, famed combo piece Pili Pala. Yeah. And I'm going to guess, given that we just got a combo commander with that in Marvin Murderous Mimic, I feel like that trend is not going to continue, and we may see Pili Pala reverse directions when we do salt scores next year.
Dana, what a wise observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it went down to 0.3. Could go back to 1.0 next year just based off of the other combos that are about to come in with it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Yeah, it does sometimes come down to the timing of it all. For example, the number 4 cards on the biggest drops here is Invoke Despair, which last year had a score of 0.9. Now it has a score of 0.5. Invoke Despair was pretty big in the Kamigawa, the stuff it was doing to standard. Mm-hmm. I have to assume that informed a little bit of how people felt about it when they saw the card on the screen and they had the, that kind of almost knee-jerk reaction to voting it in the fun EDHREC salt polls. Whereas here it's kind of Invoke Despair is not the thing that it is in those formats as it is in Commander. So it's moved plenty far down.
The rest of the list I was shocked to see Archangel of Ties, not that it got less salty, but that it was something that was salty enough to register in the first place. Very, very interesting. Number 10 too, especially another strange one. Helm of Obedience.
Yeah.
A card I was surprised to see show up here, but just a bizarre list of cards to see on here in the bottom half of this list for sure.
Archangel's like, it's a slightly less good Ghostly Prison.
Right, yeah.
Why did it have a score of 0.9 to begin with? But also,
Yeah.
0.9 isn't really a lot. Like,
Yes.
that's a thing for us to note. Like, at the rest of the point of this list, these cards that we're seeing didn't have huge scores to begin with, so
Right.
their movement is not necessarily noteworthy.
With changes like this, it doesn't take a lot of people just clicking, the 2 instead of 3 that they might have clicked last year to change these numbers.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dana, now that moves us to the Saltiest Commanders,
Yes.
individual commanders, heads of the decks that prompt the biggest salty reactions, that prompt the biggest whoa socially. We already know, of course, what rank number 1 is going to be. Hi, Nadu. Hey, you're back. Salt score of 3.04. Definitely top of that list. There are going to be, we'll probably expand to beyond just the top 10 here, because some of these legends, it is worth noting, they may produce that salty reaction from when they're in the 99 rather than in the command zone.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, that is true of the legendary creature Vorinclex Voice of Hunger, which keeps your opponent's lands tapped if they use them. I see that one far more often in the 99 than at the head of the deck, but technically it's legendary creature, so it having a salt score of 2.87, it would count as a saltiest commander, but maybe it wouldn't for your person. Like, if you're like, that's more of a card in the 99 than really a commander. But it's just a base we got to cover. Dana, I'm glad that Matt's not here. Turgid is number 3 on this list, and Turgid's a very popular mono black commander. Score of 2.72 this year. Of course, we saw it in the top 10. No surprise. Yeah, I did just feel a disturbance in the force. That was Matt getting angry that we mentioned Turgid on the show. All right, but we can move on. We can move on now.
Moving past, but Jin-Gitaxias, the first of the 2 Jin-Gitaxias versions that show up in this list, Core Augur originally, and then we're going to get Progress Tyrant down at number 10. Probably cards that almost exclusively show up in the 99 versus as commanders.
Progress Tyrant's actually not unpopular as a mono blue commander, but Jin-Gitaxias is pretty unpopular as a mono blue commander compared to like it showing up in the 99 as, for instance, a reanimation target. Yes, I used to be that guy.
The thing about a lot of these too is they're ones that people probably can avoid. You would just, if you saw this in the zone, you'd be like, oh, I'm probably not going to play against it. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't keep it from being salty when Grand Arbiter or Hikori Dustdrinker show up on the field, even if they weren't the commander. Mm-hmm. Those are still salty cards regardless of like where they came from.
Yeah, Shieldred the Apocalypse, making your opponents lose a bunch of life whenever they draw cards. That could go in a whole bunch of places. Lots of wheel decks out there. We're in the range of like salt scores of like 2.5, 2.2 kind of here. Toxrill the Corrosive. Always got to mention the Toxrill. Mm-hmm. Lordy, all the words on that card. That's not even a commander. It's just a flowchart. Like there's so much going on with that thing. Yeah. If anything, I'm actually kind of surprised not to see Coma up here, because like I feel like Coma also has a bit of that same reputation in the way that stuff like Toxrill does. So I'll admit there's something missing from this list for me personally. I was kind of like, really? Coma didn't make it? All right, I'm surprised.
Yeah, there's definitely a strange combination of cards that like, people just find Shieldred frustrating to play against, period, and they probably see it regularly too, versus, down in like the 13, 14 slot, we're looking at Send Triplets and Narset Enlightened Master, and I'm like, I feel like those are commanders that people just don't even see anymore, but reputationally, they're still salty because folks just remember what it was like to have played against them 7 years ago, or have heard stories about playing against them. They just know they're salty cards without ever having experienced it firsthand.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I do want to note really quick that this chart here that we're looking at, the Saltiest Commanders, this is different than talking about the saltiest decks. Right. Rather than just having like one salty commander in the zone, which is going to be the case for a lot of these that we just discussed, there are some commanders out there that actually have a higher salt sum from all of their cards that exist in the 99.
Yeah, and to look at like the list here, the top list, to give you an example, Turgid's a salty commander, but it's also a deck that's going to be filled with cards that people probably find to be salty because they're forcing sacrifice effects, things of that nature.
Right.
Versus Edgar Markov, salty commander, but it's a deck filled with just a bunch of like efficient vampires that don't make people upset or don't like make you salty.
Perfect example.
Those are very different things. Salty commanders, the contents of those decks are very, very different in terms of how salty they are.
Great example. Actually, there's even a cool feature on Architect if you want to see the salt sum of your deck, and you can compare that to the average. I mean, a little bit of salt is basically unavoidable in like every deck. You know, every card is going to have a little bit of like even a 0.3 or something on it. The average score that we saw last year, the average deck had a salt score of about like 36 or so. This year, it's actually gone to the mean average is a score of 40 and the median average is a score of 37. But basically, all of that is to say that we actually plugged in the average deck for each commander, their average deck from EDHREC. We plugged that into the Architect system to see what their salt sum was. And then we saw what the commanders with the highest average salt sum were. And there we saw that they were all CEDH decks. Right. Like, you know, Ishai plus Tevesh or Krom plus Timna. They all had like salt sums of like 103 and stuff like that. Where like nearly every single card had a score of at least 1.0, you know? Those ones were really taking the cake because they're competitive decks. So of course they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, the non-CEDH decks that tend to have the highest salt sums tend to be stuff like Tanawa, phasing out and doing stuff with your opponent's lands, or Angus Mackenzie is another one of them that also kind of, and it's like fog.deck that is also like glacial chasming to lock down your opponent. So like they all kind of tend to make sense, but it does tend to be the case that like the saltiest some decks, those might not be decks that have very obviously salty commanders right there in the zone. That's a distinction that we definitely, you know, ought to make here. Like if the commander's in the zone being the main salt maker, that will definitely have a big impact on the game, but the stuff in the 99 also matters a lot too. So those are two very different metrics to be aware of.
The next kind of weird, interesting statistic I want to look at here are the highest variance cards. And these are the ones that people either voted super high or super low, meaning like folks' reactions to these were wildly different depending on who the person was.
Yeah. I'm not going to lie. This is where some of the cards that actually activate me a little bit more tend to wind up. Because there are some for me, I'm just like, why doesn't it have a score for? Oh, because some people like chaos. Yeah. I'm not one of them. But some people like, you know, the scramble verses and things like that. So yeah, instead of sorting by just their average, because, you know, if someone voted a 0, someone voted a 4, it's going to average to 2. Instead of sorting these by their average, we're sorting them by their standard deviation to see how far away things actually were. In this case, the number one card that people couldn't agree on was, it's got a salt score of 1.97, but again, that means that a lot of people voted 0, a lot of people voted 4. Divine Intervention, the card that makes the game a draw. Like, all right, go off, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, I guess I get that. Like, you either find it to be funny. Oh, what a funny way to end a game. It's a draw. That's kind of an amusing little troll. Yeah. So you don't find it salty, or you're like, I can't believe you forced a draw in that game.
Right. It's just like, then why were we here? Like, it's kind of got that. You know, a bunch of others have a similar, like Scramble Verse is showing up at number 4 here at a standard deviation of 1.57. It's got a salt score of 1.9, which admittedly is actually pretty high. But like that just like completely changes where everything is. And the thing for me is that it takes 8 years to resolve. And that's where I'm just like, guys, like, just like, I got to go to bed.
And I think that's a good example, Scramble Verse, because I would wager some of the reason we have the you know, diverse variance here in some of these cards is if you've never seen a Scramble Verse resolve, you might not know how much time it can suck up.
For sure.
You're like, oh, that's not that salty. If you've never ran into a Thoracle combo, you might not know why Demonic Consultation is a salty card.
There you go.
Or if you've never played in a super competitive environment, you might be still, you know, judging Lion's Eye Diamond like it's, you know, 1998 and it's a terrible, terrible card. If you've never seen a lot of these things, you just might not know why they are salty.
Yeah, I think that might be the case for Worldfire, which was number 3 on the list. Worldfire was unbanned, and it's just not crazy popular. People aren't really playing it. But it's kind of an upsetting effect to just like, all right, it again has like that wipe the slate clean, but it's just not showing up in a lot of places. So again, the exposure has a lot to inform about whether the votes will be high. The thing that I actually want to catch here, though, there's a card that really stands out, and that's the card Badlands that shows up at number 2 on this. It's got that standard deviation of 1.65, ended up with a total salt score of 1.0. But, I mean, Badlands, that's just the original red-black dual land. But that shows up really, really high here. I have to assume because it has an extremely high price tag, as do a whole bunch of other cards like dual lands. I think this is probably potentially the result of like us having a smaller sample size this year. That's potentially a thing that could be affecting here. But like there's a high standard deviation on this. A lot of people voted low, a lot of people voted high. Dana, what do you make of it?
Yeah, it's not so much that an original dual land showed up on the list that I find confusing. It's the Badlands that I don't understand. I would have, you know, because there are more expensive, it's expensive, but like Volcanic Island and Tundra and Underground Sea are more expensive. Seeing Badlands at number 2, that's the thing that confuses me.
So yeah, Dana, I actually just went farther down this list. The next dual lane that I could find was Savannah at spot like 62. So there is, I guess, a trend here to notice. It's just like there are high price cards. And in fact, removing it from the dual lane specifically, Time Twister is also on this list. And that we know is also an extremely expensive card. I feel like this just has to be related to like kind of an activation of people's feelings about like, it almost feels like you're being gate kept out of things that you want to play just by the price of these cards. So there's a little bit of resentment activated just because of how expensive some of these game pieces can be, which feels a little bit ludicrous to be playing in a game where we're just trying to kick back and throw a couple dragons and dinosaurs at each other.
I mean, I definitely have noted on this show before in the past, like I used to have dual lands in my decks and I've taken them out in the last couple of years. I don't have any of the ABU duels anymore because people's reaction had changed over the years as the price went up. 8 or 10 years ago, no one really thought very much about seeing a Savannah in a deck when it was $60, which is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but that's a much different price tag than $300. And the reaction back then compared to what it is now, no one blinked an eye, 10 years ago. And I discovered in the last couple of years when people would see a dual land, they would immediately assume you're playing at a much higher power level or much more seriously than maybe you were.
Sure.
And it just wasn't worth that reaction to me. So that's definitely something that's changed, at least in my experience.
Yeah, that's definitely worth noting. One final thing that I want to mention about this highest variance chart that we've got is that at spot number 11, the card Ravages of War is there, which is basically just a duplicate of Armageddon. Armageddon is not anywhere close to that. People kind of like universally agree that Armageddon is like a nub, but Ravages of War, I think this is again, like people just don't see it a lot. Therefore, there's not the same instinct to it. It still has a perfectly high salt rank. It's actually at salt rank number 20. It got an overall score of 2.56, but it was one that a lot of people voted very low on, in addition to a lot of people voting high on. And that isn't a thing that I can say for Armageddon, as it turns out, which is just like kind of like, got my eye on you, y'all. And I think that just comes down to the exposure to some of these cards. Armageddon is a lot more famously what it does.
Yeah.
Ravages of War is maybe, it's not the metonymic stand-in that we all say when we talk about land destruction. When we talk about land destruction, we say Armageddon, not Ravages of War.
I actually think it might be kind of the opposite in this case, because I believe
really?
Ravages had a reprint in Fallout. So I'm wondering if that recent return to the forefront didn't kind of do the opposite effect where, I'm seeing it because this person cracked one in a Fallout pack and put it in their deck. And now I'm seeing it in a way that I didn't see it for the previous X amount of years when it was a $100 card.
You know what? I like your theory a lot. Yeah, maybe the version of that card that has Pip-Boy on it is doing a lot to make people think that it's not as gross of a card as it can be. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's very interesting. But this does kind of lead to some final thoughts wrapping up about all this data that we've been able to go over here. A final point that I do want to hit on is, again, that bit of exposure, which we've hammered home a couple of times this episode. But there are a lot of cards out there that I think would be a lot higher if they were just straight up more popular.
Sure.
And I noticed plenty of them while I was voting. I came across them and I was just like, give that a really high salt score. Cards like Naked Singularity. Naked Singularity changes everyone's mana production, where instead of producing white, your land's going to produce blue, but instead of producing blue, that land is going to produce black. Like, what a nightmare to keep track of, but it doesn't have a high salt score because who plays Naked Singularity? It's barely showing up in 400 decks. Did you know there's a green version of Telepathy that's called Revelation? And it does the same thing that Telepathy does, where everyone plays with their hands revealed. Yeah. It's only showing up in 600 decks. No one knows what it is, but both of those cards are a nightmare to play against. That's why people don't like playing them. That's why they don't see play. But if they did, their salt scores would be much, much higher. And that just is kind of an interesting thing. Like, Dana, does the exposure that you see does that affect your votes as much, do you think? Do you try and have that objective thing, or does it sometimes come down to how much I've truly seen these?
I think seeing them makes a difference, as we just talked about with Ravages. But I also think some cards, even if you never see them, and even if you don't, like if you think about Revelation, knowing what you know about Telepathy, well, yeah, obviously that's a salty card. But it's not one of those cards in kind of the Magic zeitgeist that people think of as being a salty card. Mm-hmm. Even if you have never seen Stasis, it has this reputation as being a really salty piece. So despite maybe never having sat at a pod where someone plays it, everyone kind of just knows it's a salty card. And Revelation and Naked Singularity don't have that aura about them. They don't have this history of being problematic cards that has just become part of the cultural knowledge you have in Magic.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of fame attached to a whole lot of these cards.
Yeah.
You mentioned before that you expect that in the future, maybe cards like Nadu might, tick down over time, because right now we've had the most recent, big blast of Modern Horizon stuff. And I think that's very much reflected in this data. Are there any other changes that you might expect to see next year? Or do you think that that's mostly the kind of thing, is that those Modern Horizon cards might mellow out? Is that the main one that you expect to see, or are there any others?
That's mainly it. My guess is a lot of the stuff, that the changes we will see from year to year to year moving forward are going to be the Nadu level commanders that are suddenly in everyone's mind because they're so dominant, both in Commander and other formats, and the One Ring kind of cards that are in everyone's mind because they're just in so many decks, as well as speaking of other formats. So I think those are the things you're going to see. You'll see those cards show up on the list as they become ascendant, and you'll see them kind of slide back down as they become less popular for whatever reason.
Gotcha. I think plenty of the cards that we saw jump up this year, like the Sire of Stagnations and some of those, I think those were also very much affected by some of the commanders that we got. Yeah. I anticipate that probably some of those will eventually tick back down to their relative normalcy for a while. So I think that's something for us to acknowledge, is that these can have little spikes like a heart monitor before they, as things release that activate them. And frankly, I think sometimes that can be the case for the way that prices work on cards. I think sometimes the SALT scores can react in similar ways. A commander came out that makes this card really good. The demand increases, the price increases. I think sometimes the SALT stuff can do that. It's not just about the cards themselves being salty, but also other cards that they then make better. Sometimes that we experience a spike, but I imagine that will probably also settle out too.
Yeah, and the last, I guess, point I would make here is, bear in mind who you're playing against and what your play group is like. Just because a card or a deck or an archetype or a playstyle is considered salty by the larger EDH community doesn't mean it's a problem if people in your play group are into doing that thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
And just because something doesn't show up as being salty doesn't mean it can't be a problem in your group as well.
Completely, yeah. Dana, as you said, there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into this. So I am going to ask you to take the Rest in Peace out of the RIP deck, please.
I will, because you asked nicely. I'm glad to comply.
Yeah. Rip to rip, please. If only. Yeah, a lot of subjectivity that goes into it. And again, these are it's a fun bit of, stuff to do in the community. It's just these fun voting. And you discover a lot of really cool new cards this way as well. I actually got to say, there's a few that I didn't know existed. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to log that away for a future Challenge the Stats, maybe. Which we're sorry we didn't get to a Challenge the Stats on this episode. We had a lot of other data to get into, all right? It was a lot to go through. Sorry, everyone. So it'll be interesting to see how these scores are affected next year. Listeners, you know the drill. You got to let us know what you voted for. What are the saltiest cards that you don't want to see, especially ones that didn't appear in the top 10? What other cards would you put up there? What high variance ones do you think exist out there as well? There's a lot of data to go through here, and definitely tell us how you think the scores might be shaped in the future by all of that. But with that, Dan, I think we're going to call this very data-heavy episode to a close. So if our listeners want to get in touch with you, where is it that they can find you online?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at the handle Joseph M. Schultz. And you can also find the cast everywhere online at EDHRECast. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at edhrecast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.